Imagine having to make a choice between a nation's desperate, urgent need for babies right now and the absolute necessity of caring for its elderly tomorrow. Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and deeply consequential debate that's currently unfolding in Singapore. It's basically a massive collision between two huge forces. On one side, you have a historic demographic crisis, and on the other, the incredibly strict realities of healthcare funding. We're going to be looking really closely at the data and the arguments surrounding Singapore's Central Provident Fund MediSave scheme. There is growing public pressure to actually use those national old age savings to fund complex fertility treatments. It's one of those topics that perfectly blends emotional, very human desperation with cold, hard clinical data and fiscal policy. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. 0.87. Let that number sink in for a second. That is Singapore's projected total fertility rate for the year 2025, and it is a historic, totally unprecedented low. Now, to put that into perspective for you, a population usually needs a replacement level of about 2.1 just to maintain its current size and stability. So when a fertility rate plunges all the way down to 0.87, that isn't just a minor dip. We are talking about an existential crisis for the nation, and naturally, this has led to a frantic, almost panicked search for immediate policy solutions.
Here is a roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the historic demographic crisis. Then, the diminishing returns of IVF. Third, the egg freezing reality. After that, we'll get into the PGTA controversy, followed by the super-aged healthcare burden. And finally, we'll weigh prudence against desperate hope.
Section 1. A historic demographic crisis, the push to expand MediSave.
So, in response to that frankly terrifying 0.87 fertility rate we just talked about, people are understandably panicking. They want to break open the piggy bank. Right now, there are very urgent calls from the public to open up Singapore's Central Provident Fund MediSave scheme. Now, for some context, MediSave is a compulsory national savings scheme, and it is strictly designed for healthcare. But because of this absolute fertility panic, people are actively lobbying for a massive, unprecedented shift in how these national funds are used. Specifically, the source material highlights demands to lift the financial cap on repeated IVF cycles, to fund elective egg freezing, and even to subsidize controversial add-ons like pre-implantation genetic testing, which is also known as PGTA. But, as you'll see in just a moment, the source text argues really strongly that opening these specific floodgates might actually be profoundly wasteful.
Section 2. Diminishing returns of IVF, the clinical reality of multiple cycles.
To really understand why unlimited funding is so heavily debated right now, we first need to look at the current rules in place. As it stands, couples can withdraw up to 6,000 Singapore dollars for their very first IVF cycle, 5,000 for their second, and 4,000 for subsequent cycles, all capped at a strict $15,000 lifetime limit. Now, this tiered structure isn't just some arbitrary government penny pinching. Actually, it's a threshold that's built on hard medical truths about when it makes sense to finally stop putting the human body and, frankly, the wallet through the ringer. The medical data strongly tells us that there is severe diminishing returns when we try to boost birth rates through endless repeated IVF cycles. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. The diminishing returns are incredibly stark. Data from a major UK study shows that while an overall first cycle has a roughly 30% success rate for women aged 40 to 42, that number plummets down to a mere 12%. And even if those patients push through a totally grueling 6 cycles, the cumulative prognosis-adjusted live birth rate reaches only 32%. Wow, I mean, the drop-off here is just severe. The clinical reality is undeniably harsh. IVF is not a magic bullet. If 3 rounds fail, the likelihood that a 4th or a 5th is going to suddenly succeed is just painfully low. So pumping national savings into endless failed cycles is, according to our sources, financially imprudent.
Section 3. The egg freezing reality, the illusion of preservation.
Now, we really have to ask a fundamental question here. Is freezing eggs a medical treatment, or is it a social choice? Singapore actually legalized elective egg freezing in 2023 for women aged 21 to 37, and naturally, there's a huge push to let women use MediSave to pay for it. But we have to contrast the core purposes here. CPF MediSave is, fundamentally, a critical safety net meant for essential medical expenses and treating pathological illnesses. Elective egg freezing, on the other hand, is officially defined as a social and lifestyle choice. It is not a treatment for an underlying illness. Because of this, the Ministry of Health has so far drawn a very hard line, maintaining that MediSave to not fund it in order to preserve that strict threshold of medical necessity.
But beyond just the legal definitions, the actual return on investment here is genuinely staggering.
A massive UCLA study analyzed what actually happens after women freeze their eggs, and what they found is that while the sheer number of women freezing their eggs has absolutely skyrocketed, an overwhelming 94.3% of those eggs remain entirely unused. Just sit with that for a second. Only 5.7% of women actually return to use their frozen eggs for IVF within a 7-year period. So allowing mandatory national savings to fund an elective procedure where over 90% of the biological material is literally never even used would be, as the source text argues, a gross wastage of funds that are desperately needed for genuine medical care.
Section 4. The PGTA Controversy. A lucrative but flawed add-on.
Look, it makes total sense that when you are desperate, you'll pay for anything that promises even a glimmer of hope. When patients face repeated IVF failures, they very often turn to expensive add-on procedures. And one of the absolute most popular right now is PGTA. This is a test that's touted to screen embryos for chromosomal abnormalities, supposedly to improve your chances of IVF success. It has become a highly lucrative offering for fertility clinics, but the actual clinical value? Well, that is fiercely contested. A multi-center randomized trial demonstrated that PGTA actually fails to improve cumulative live birth rates compared to conventional IVF among women with a good prognosis. The grand promise simply doesn't match up with the clinical reality.
And honestly, the issues with PGTA go much deeper than just failing to improve birth rates. The procedure is plagued by some really severe controversies. We're talking about high risks of misdiagnoses, which can lead to the absolutely tragic discarding of potentially viable, perfectly healthy embryos just because they were erroneously labeled as mosaic. This massive failure to deliver on its grand promises has actually sparked a whole wave of class action lawsuits in the United States against IVF genetic testing companies. These lawsuits are alleging consumer fraud, breach of warranty, and claims of deliberately misleading vulnerable patients. So you have to ask yourself, should a mandatory national savings fund really be used to subsidize an add-on that is currently facing consumer fraud lawsuits? The source material argues a definitive, resounding no.
Which brings us to the ultimate, perhaps most uncomfortable question underlying this entire explainer today. If we deplete these national savings right now, today, on statistically improbable fertility treatments, who pays for tomorrow?
Section 5. The super-aged healthcare burden. The collision of two demographics.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that while everyone is so focused on the dropping birth rate, there is a second, equally massive demographic crisis quietly accelerating right in the background. Yes, the birth rate is dropping, but the population is also aging incredibly rapidly. By the year 2026, Singapore will officially transition into a super-aged society. That means over 21% of its population will be aged 65 and above. Couple that reality with one of the highest life expectancies in the entire world, almost 84 years, and the looming healthcare burden waiting just around the corner is absolutely staggering.
And this looming burden is exactly why MediSave was created in the first place. Its core design is to act as an impenetrable safety net. It is strictly ring-fenced to cover essential medical expenses, to fund long-term care in old age, and to help manage chronic diseases. If we drain this safety net today for low-yield fertility treatments, the government, which, let's be real, means the taxpayers, will inevitably have to foot the bill when those citizens eventually grow old and outlive their depleted savings. It fundamentally risks shifting a massive financial shortfall directly onto the state, effectively cannibalizing the old-age healthcare safety net.
Section 6. Prudence over desperate hope. The final verdict.
So, the source material we've explored today makes a very firm, clear argument. Look, the crash of Singapore's fertility rate to 0.87 is a genuine crisis, and the empathy we all feel for couples struggling with infertility is completely valid, and it's a noble sentiment. But public policy, especially when it comes to a nation's foundational financial safety net, has to be guided by hard clinical evidence and long-term fiscal responsibility. Expanding MediSave's scope to cover endless cycles of failed IVF, highly underused elective egg freezing, and highly controversial PGTA testing offers negligible demographic benefits. Instead, it poses a downright catastrophic threat to the entire elderly healthcare ecosystem. I want to leave you with this final, really powerful thought drawn straight from our sources. Singapore must not sacrifice the dignity and medical security of our super-aged future on the altar of a demographic quick fix that the medical literature tells us simply will not work. It's such a stark reminder. While we desperately want to solve today's demographic panic, we just cannot afford to bankrupt tomorrow's medical security to do it. So, what do you think? How exactly should a nation balance the very real, very desperate hopes of today with the absolutely guaranteed needs of tomorrow? It's a tough one. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.